Our next speaker is actually the brainchild for the conference. So we need to thank Itay for having the idea to celebrate Mark's 75th birthday with his work on interactivism. And Georgi, just so you know, the Senior Scholars is more about your the time or since you've been interested in interactivism more than your chronological age. So don't worry, you're not old yet. And Itay is going to talk to us about interaction and experience, consciousness, connectivity, and other impossible.
Relieved.
Good.
So we're actually continuing right away.
Yeah, I made a mistake. There's the breaks after your talk.
Okay. Well then, let me wait for a second. Yes. Hello, everybody. You know, with the people that give their presentations today, as we've seen already, are all people that have known Mark for some time. And in my case, I started I did my PhD on mental representation. And it occurred to me at some point that, you know, I read about conceptual role theories and functional, you know, the notion of function. And it occurred to me at some point that representation has to do with regulation, action regulation, and so on. And so I started to work in that direction. And after a while, I heard from one or two persons that there is this sage in Bethlehem who's been working long and hard and developed some incredible ideas in that direction. So I went to meet Mark, and yeah, and that was an incredible influence for me in many ways. And so there's definitely a sincere depth here. But you know, in the intellectual world, sometimes we pay our best debt to the people we love and appreciate by actually talking about certain points, certain places where, unfortunately, our ways have to differ somewhat. And this is going to be my topic today. My major interest over the years turned into consciousness, and this is what I'm going to talk about today mostly. And at the risk of representing some views that perhaps will not be so popular for some of the audience here, that's what I have to. This is what I wish to talk about today. So let me begin then by sharing the screen. Okay. So my title is Interaction and Experience, with subtitle Consciousness, Normativity, and Other Impossible Emergence. Actually, the title is, or at least the subtitle, is not entirely reflective of what I managed to talk about today, because I wasn't able to really include much about normativity. That has proven to be too ambitious, perhaps. So I start with consciousness, and that's probably what I'll stick with, I guess. So my first part is about emergence and what I call the logic of disentanglement. And here we get into, well, I just want to say one more thing. Perhaps, you know, Mark talked about consciousness and experience in various places over the years, of course. But I mean, I think it's not like one of the, perhaps the core of his thought, as far as I understand, if we compare to other topics such as representation or normativity or language and so on. So maybe that's one kind of caveat or something to bear in mind. But I just looked at various places where he does talk about consciousness, because I think this is really, you know, some sort of something that we cannot afford to ignore. Okay, so let's begin. So what is the method of disentanglement? That's what I call it. But I think we saw already yesterday that Bickert's case for interactivism is often based on what we may call a method of disentanglement, or MD. What I mean by this is that given a problem space, let's call it P, one first relieves P of certain foundational assumptions which hinder a solution to problems that are immanent to that problem space. So getting some unnecessary hindrances and obstacles out of the way. For example, reading P of commitments to substance metaphysics, we just saw that with Richard's talk as well, or to exclusive reliance on explicit definitions, or the primacy of encodings in theories of mental representation, or of transduction in perception, and so on and so forth, right? Now, the rationale behind it, I think it's quite clear, is to avoid dead ends. Mark calls it aporia quite often, and thereby pave the way for informative explanations, hopefully. Right? Now, I think you will agree that this is eminently sensible as a general method, but clearly, like, this is just a point of logic, the removal of obstinate obstacles is, of course, no guarantee for a solution, and everybody would agree with that, including Mark. It is at best, but a necessary condition on our way, hopefully, to a solution to the problem at hand. Excuse me. So in each particular case, given the target phenomenon T and the application of our method of disentanglement to T, we must inquire specifically how far, right? In this case, the interactivist template, but how far can it take us in our attempt to explain T? Okay, so let's see how this relates to process, emergence, and explanation. So interactivism endorses a process metaphysics. Again, we just heard about it, in which all phenomena pertaining to life, mind, and society, perhaps more as well, are emergent, and more particularly are emergent process patterns or process organizations. It therefore stresses, right? It stresses the significance of emergence, obviously. And it rallies against principles and commitments which it identifies as blocking the possibility of the emergence of relevant target phenomena, such as normativity or representation or propositional knowledge, and again, so on and so forth, the list goes on. Now, given the previously mentioned caveat regarding this method, MD, my topic really will be to inquire about the explanatory status of two specific targets, consciousness and normativity. Well, actually, again, as I said, it will be mostly about consciousness, at least for the purposes of this present talk. And to inquire, can interactivism take us far enough in this respect? All right, so let's start then with part 2, interactivism and the hard problem of consciousness. So I think all of us heard about the hard problem of consciousness, I presume, and the idea of brute emergence, which lies at its heart. But let's just rehearse it quickly. David Chalmers associated with that term, and in the earliest paper, I think, where he presents it, even before his book, when he talks about what that problem means, essentially he uses such expressions as, why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all, right? Why? This seems to be somehow mysterious or puzzling or, resisting satisfying explanation. And if we look at it, right, we can see that it has to do with our canonical understanding of the physical and the phenomenal, respectively. And the idea is that we understand physical in terms of such things as function and structure and dynamical behavior, whereas we understand phenomenal primarily in terms of subjectivity and the raw fields of experience, the so-called what it's like, of of conscious experience, what it's like to see this cup and enjoy the view of the mountains there and so on. The trouble consists in the, well, presumably that's the idea. The trouble consists in the absence of an intelligible conceptual link between the two. Here, in the words of Thomas Huxley from 1866, as you know, Huxley, famously known as, I guess it's Darwin's bulldog, right? He was definitely no enemy of science. But this is what he has to say. How is it that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp? Okay, I want to say something of how that relates to an anti-emergence argument in the case of consciousness. I just realized that there's something else which may be important, and I didn't include it here, but perhaps I can mention it later if it will come out. Well, Bickert interprets, at least in some places, interprets Chalmers' endorsement of the hard problem as based on the notion, the allegedly flawed notion, that cause or causal analysis cannot model experience. So that Chalmers somehow assumes this. I think that Chalmers' claim concerning the hard problem is somewhat more nuanced. Essentially, the idea is that no analysis in terms of function, structure, and behavior, which we can summarize as FSB, no analysis in FSB's terms entails experience, right? And well, that the analysis in terms of the physical sciences comes to that, and that always, fail to entail experience. And so the argument against emergence, the emergence of consciousness, is nothing more than a reiteration of this general observation. It essentially simply tells us that at any arbitrary level of physical complexity, right? You can tell whatever story about brain processes and so on. The theoretical gap between FSB and experience remains unbridged. That's essentially the idea. Now, okay. Now I think that Bicker's approach to the problem, when he does speak about consciousness, can be fairly characterized, in my opinion, as, in some sense, deflationist. Now, what I mean by deflationist, right, it has the tendency to lessen the importance of a problem, to break it down, to somehow deconstruct it. And let me say something about it. I think it involves, first of all, a critique of prevailing presuppositions. We saw that already, right? Presuppositions about encoding, about substance metaphysics, about, he speaks also about the importance of avoiding confusing various levels of experience. Very interesting discussions, but I won't get into it now. In a more positive vein, he also, the idea is that there's an attempt to address the problem piecemeal through various different strategies, so they kind of like give a kick here, solve this problem, show that this one is not, there's something inaccurate there, or we can take care of that specific aspect, and so on and so forth. And the desired accumulated effect of all of that is ultimately, hopefully, to dissolve the problems. In fact, I think Mark uses sometimes this expression, right, that it's more of a dissolution rather than a solution. But to make the problem in that way eventually dissolve, by and large, so at least important aspects of it. Now, I must confess that in this respect, I'm skeptical. First of all, perhaps on aesthetics ground. I mean, I believe God is an aesthete. That is, I don't think he would allow a beautiful problem to suffer ugly solution in that sense, that he kind of like, you break it down to all these different aspects and together they assemble some sort of ugly solution, so to speak. But of course, I mean, this is where we're talking about aesthetic intuitions. You may not follow me here, you may not see the point. Then I of course do more than that. In the next few slides, I'll try to illustrate more precisely why I think that certain of the strategies which Mark happened to take actually do not really dissolve the problem as perhaps is hoped or expected. Okay. So the first attempt, let's say, or the first thing I wish to talk about has to do with the analysis of experience. In this case, more specifically of visual experience, and even more specifically, the example of seeing red. So there's a famous paper by Kevin O'Regan and Alva Noy from about 20 years ago, in which they offer a theory of an analysis of experience from a sensory motor contingency theory. And as part of it, they analyze color perception. I think Mark is quite sympathetic to certain aspects of that approach. Now, very briefly, on this view, seeing red consists in somehow discerning a pattern, an invariant pattern of sensory motor contingency, which is unique to red patches, let's say. Now, what does it mean, sensory motor contingency? Roughly speaking, it's the dependency relations, right? Lawful dependencies between sensory stimulation and some sort of anticipatory motor output. So this commerce between the two. And so once we discern an invariant pattern, which is unique, well, in this case, to the experience of red, let's say, assuming that we can extract something meaningful of that sort, and there's an interesting discussion in the paper, but never mind. Mark speaks about, he uses different terms, maybe more something like a perceptive anticipation, if I'm getting it right, but in a similar line to this work, which is based on the concept of sensory motor contingency. Now, I think there is a problem here, which was noticed already by people even in the same volume where this paper was written. So, I think it expresses what I wanted to say. There's a short piece by Oberauer there in the same volume, where he speaks about, raises the question. He says we can raise the question: is this anticipatory knowledge, or is this, sensory motor contingencies, which presumably constitute or ground the experience, or in terms of which we explain the phenomenal experience, are they themselves phenomenal? Are they phenomenally felt? Now, if not, right, if they're not, then essentially we are explaining one thing, A, in terms of another, B, where B is non-phenomenal in itself. It involves no experience. So here the trouble is that we end up, or at least we run a serious risk of ending with eliminativism, or as it is called more recently, illusionism. Now, there are some, serious people that embraces illusionism, namely the idea that phenomenal consciousness is in some sense a trick, or that our mind plays on us, a sophisticated illusion. Some serious people, Daniel Dennett, Nicholas Humphreys, others, Keith Frankish, Jay Garfield, excellent scholars, but I think it's a very radical sort of solution. If what you have to say is that consciousness essentially doesn't exist, well, good luck. It's definitely not so attractive, I would say. But on the other hand, if yes, right, if we say that this anticipatory knowledge is phenomenally felt, then I think we are, and I think again with Oberauer, that we are back with the original problem. Namely, and here we can use, even Chalmers' language. Why is this weir of information processing like something? Now, I know it's not information processing in the ordinary sense, it's more dynamically articulated and so on. But given these qualifications, we can still ask, why is this weir of information processing like something? And wasn't this the question with which we began? Okay. Are we doing so fine so far? I mean, I was expecting that there'll be a break. So may I be excused just for 5-10 seconds to get a little bit more water? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead. We're
Okay.
good on time.
Sorry. Okay, back. Yes, thank you. Let's move to a second gambit, let's call it, right? And this one has to do with the explanatory gap. As you know, that's often just another name for the hard problem, the explanatory gap. Well, Bickert in some places again tells us, surprisingly, that there is no gap, bridgeable or not. And he says a little more, the experiential realm. So why there is no gap, I suppose, because this follows right after. The experiential realm is complex and multiform, leaving no one single gap between non-experiential and experiential. Okay, so what are we to make of that? That is the question. Now, in some sense, it's true, of course, that various types of experience emerge variably, right? Some experiences are more basic than others, right? And experience is non-monolithic. And obviously, if you think of the ability to use a larger span of memory or greater anticipation or greater reflective capacities and so on and so forth, these will come later. These would be more, sophisticated type of experience. And of course, again, so we have some kind of hierarchy. So far, so good. And all of that would depend on evolutionary and developmental and sociocultural factors and so on and so forth. But a hard problem concerns, I think, something different. It concerns the transition from no experience to experience, right? This transition from a certain stage, let's say T, in which there was, well, if you believe that consciousness is an emergent, you assume a certain background in nature where there was no experience at all, followed by a later time in which there is an experience. That's the transition we're talking about. This is the problematic element here, namely the having of an experience per se. So it's not the question, that there are different types of experiences, right? But the transition to why does an experience in the first place? And that is also, I believe, I follow Galen Strawson here, that this does not seem to be a gradual affair. That transition from a background where there was no experience whatsoever, and at some point there is an experience. Once experience arises, that's a switch. That seems like a binary switch. Sentience is like pregnancy. You're either on the bus or off the bus, to quote Ken Casey. And well, it's a magical bus, so I recommend be on the bus. So that's about the gap. Maybe we can come back to some issues here. The third gambit concern experience and what Mark calls reflective consciousness, or in other terms, meta-awareness. Now, Bickert devotes much space considerable space to reflective consciousness whenever he speaks about consciousness. What is reflective consciousness? Essentially, is a higher order process of meta-awareness, whose object, right, the object of that meta-awareness is first level kind of experience or first level flow of the direct commerce, interactive commerce with the world. Now, at times, it seems as if Bickert flirts with the idea that reflective consciousness is generative of phenomenality as such, that in fact, it's this higher level reflective process that brings about phenomenality. I'm saying, I mean, I'll have more to say about it, but at times it seems that this is what's going on, or at least, you know, that it comes close to that idea. Now, I'm not alone in thinking that this is a highly problematic idea. It is often comes out in critiques of higher order thought and higher order perception theories. The notion that you cannot make a certain mental state conscious merely by representing it by some higher order state or something like this. Now, I'm not saying that this is Marx's view in any strict sense. But the way I like to put it when I try to formulate the problem is a little bit different. It's simply to say that experience cannot possibly be a function of a relation whose relata are wholly insentient. So let us assume that we have two relata A and B, two terms of a relation. If both of them are insentient, both of them are numb, both of them are lacking any sort of experientiality, then you can let them coil and curl and access each other and reflect and deflect and so on and so forth. But none of that can do the trick, because none can present, if those terms are in themselves intrinsically numb, none of them can present the other phenomenally. I guess the slogan here is that access does not beget sentience, or no sentience from sapience, or sentience from merely from epistemic access. It's just not the kind of dynamic that can generate experience where none existed before. Now, having said that, I must, of course, in all fairness, state that ultimately it appears that this isn't Bickert's view, because in other places, or in the same discussion, let's say, but other paragraphs perhaps, he affirms the reality of first level experience, non-reflective experience. He speaks also about, so a 6 months old baby doesn't have much reflection, but is certainly capable of having some form of consciousness or experience. All right, so, well, that's, again, fantastic. But then it seems that the hard problem remains intact, at least insofar as we're now concerned, how is it that those first level experiential states attain their experientiality, their sentience, right? Their phenomenality. So again, I mean, if that is the case, we may avoid the problems of a higher order awareness and so on, as they generate the one that's supposed to do the trick, but we go back to square one with respect to the major problem. All right, the fourth and final gambit that I'll speak about today is perhaps the most intriguing. It involves an argument from internal relatedness. And again, I think we've seen that Mark uses internal relatedness in various ways, various contexts, always very interesting. And we find something of it here as well. So according to Bickert, he says, qualities of experience are internally related to the experience of which there are qualities. Now, if so, right, we know that if so, then for any experience E is tied to a certain pattern of anticipatory flow, such that when a certain pattern P, let's say, of anticipatory flow, such that when P is realized, so is E, right? And we know that because, the meaning of internal relatedness means that there is an essential connection. So of course, there's a strong concomitance here. If you have the one, you thereby have the other. And for that reason also, he claims that zombies are impossible. And as you know, zombies are often used as perhaps more sexy or pictorial sort of way of presenting the idea of the hard problem. They come up in this discussion. Impossible according to Mark. And I think the reason is that, again, there is no P without E, right? If the connection here is essential, then once you have the proper pattern, experience necessarily follow or is realized, or however you put it. Okay. Now, here again, I think there's a problem in the sense that at best, the argument works only if P does indeed necessitate E. But this is exactly the issue at stake. This is exactly the issue under dispute. And notice what's happening here. If P is itself non-phenomenally characterized, if it is characterized in terms of sensory motor contingencies, if it's some pattern of that kind of thing, then the claim that it constitutes or necessitates experience remains as puzzling as ever. I mean, this is exactly the point that is under dispute. So merely stipulating that there are some processes in which these things always come together seem in some sense to, have at least the air of question begging. And I think that the claim of necessity remains puzzling here in this context. Now, I want to say more about it on a more general level. I want to speak a little bit about why I think that the hard problem, perhaps best characterized or usefully characterized, I find it useful to think of it as a transcendental challenge. One does not obviate the hard problem by claiming such claims as, for example, suppose that psi is a phenomenal process or phenomenal, state, and phi is physical, right? So we say, well, one claim, some people have recourse to the notion of identity. So they claim that psi is equal to phi, right? The relation between phenomenal and the physical, or some physical configurations, is that of identity. And identities, they claim, need no explaining. That's the solution. Why identities need no explaining? Well, because it makes no point, or it seems silly to say, if you hear that Tony Curtis is Bernie Schwartz, and you say, well, gee, that's very surprising. How come? Why, right? Well, what do you mean, why, stupid? This is just the case, right? End of story. So there's something attractive here in that idea that identities need no explaining. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it seems to me that there's something somewhat similar in this notion that phi and psi are internally related. If that is used as a solution to the hard problem, as an important, perhaps a crucial step in arguing for even dissolving the problem. Because, again, I think that the query, our problem, our puzzle, our query, is what I would like to say transcendental, in a loose sense, not exactly Kant's terminology, but in a sufficiently meaningful sense, I believe. Namely, I think that the problem here is, how is it possible for this to be the case? How is it possible, metaphysically speaking, right? How could the phenomenal and the physical, given the canonical understanding and so on, how could it be the case that one is nothing but a certain configuration of the other? In other words, what are the conditions of possibility that enable phi and psi to be so related? How could it be the case, right? Sorry, let me go back here. Yes, now since I mentioned the term transcendental, perhaps I should use an example. Right. Yes. Well, Kant, of course, right? Think of how Kant's reconstruction of the notion of causation, right? Kant was assuming, for good reasons or bad reasons, but essentially, to a large extent, was accepting Hume's analysis of causation, and yet realizing or insisting that there has to be more to causation, right? That there has to be some element of necessity and so on. And the problem, the transcendental challenge was, what are the conditions of possibility? What must reality be such that causation could have necessity in a world in which Hume's analysis is correct, according to Kant? And notice that the solution involved some radical change of the rules of the game, right? And that's the point I wish to convey, really, if there's a point I'd like to say today. The difficulty is not resolved by postulating the desired relation, whether it's identity or internal relatedness or whatever. There has to be some other ways of, or more radical perhaps, to address this challenge, if indeed it is a transcendental challenge, as I claim it to be. And I think that's also why it answers. Okay, never mind. That's not necessary. Okay, so that leads me into part 3. May I, someone can say how we're doing on time? There's not a lot left, but yeah.
Yep, like about 10 minutes.
Okay, sure. We do have time then. So yeah, just some reflections before I close. Something about structuralism and well, let's see what the hard problem of matter is. But in the discussion about consciousness in recent years and metaphysics of consciousness, there is this argument, which I think is quite significant, which we may call the intrinsic nature argument. And we can describe it roughly like this. Like that science's description of reality, as we said before, is restricted to FSB, by and large, function, structure, and behavior or dynamical behavior. And yet, we have good reasons to believe that there is more to reality than lawful acting, more than just objective exteriors. Okay, so yeah, I mean, science essentially, I mean, give us, in a way, you can think of it as rules, right? But you think of the lawful behavior, rules of acting, right? So we have actors that do certain things, obey certain laws, whether it's Newton's laws or Coulomb laws, or and we can describe something, right? We can say, so I can say I have two objects here. One of them is perhaps with a mass twice as big as the other one. If I wish to push them in the same direction at the same speed, I obviously have to put more force in the second one because its mass is greater, other things being equal, and so on. And that define various. This is in this sort of lawful relatedness. Essentially, we account for concepts such as mass but the question remains: who is doing this acting? What are these things in themselves? What is their intrinsic nature? What is their quidditas? And if you don't want to just end up with a world, and some people do, but with a world who's merely like empty structure or just relations, there has to be some way to consider the notion of an inner side to things, the intrinsic nature. And more than that, consciousness furnishes us with what we may call an existential proof that there is indeed this inner side to things. Because in our own case, in our own person, we know that obviously we can be in various moods, elation or frustration or irritation, right? And these will structured differently. There are dispositions for behavior, how we snap or do not snap at the world and so on. But there is more to that. There is always more to that, to the external appearances, right? There is a whole world that is not exhausted by that sort of description, which we know in our own case. And if we generalize, I'm not taking yet the more bold generalization to say that the inner side of things is necessarily consciousness. But if we just say that there is an inner side to things, this is already something which is rather significant, because it points to, it's a pity Terry is not here, but it points to incompleteness, right? To a certain incompleteness in the general way that physical science described the world for no faults of its own. This is not a critique of science. It's just an observation that there are more things under heaven and earth, Horatio, more things than your philosophy dreams of, more things that can be gleaned from the formal descriptions of science, from just the appearance and the behavior of things. And if we follow this line, interestingly, there are some people, Galen Strawson and Hedda Hassel-Murk, began to speak recently about the hard problem of matter. Now, I'm not sure that this is an ideal term. I'm not sure that this is really a hard problem in the same sense of the hard problem of consciousness. But the idea here is rather interesting, that if physicalism goes with this notion that with the expectation that science will tell us about nature, about what matter is, right? And we bear in mind this incompleteness, we now may ask, what is the physical matter in and of itself? What seems to be rather strange here is that, opposite to functionalism, which thought of mental states as being abstract, and of the physical as its realization, concrete realization, here it seems that the physical descriptions are in some sense functional, in some sense are in some sense schematic, and the intrinsic nature of matter remains a mystery. So what is the nature of nature? What is the nature of matter? This is, I guess, what they call the hard problem of matter. What is behind the mathematical structure described by physics? All right, so okay, there's two more slides, I believe. Interactivism. Let's speak about interactivism now a little bit in light of this emerging picture, at least in my talk here, about the metaphysical revisionism. Because both the hard problem of consciousness and the so-called hard problem of mind point at the need to go beyond orthodox materialist commitments, maybe to some extent following Richard here, but in a very different direction. To make better sense of consciousness and of the intrinsic nature of things more largely, metaphysical, I think that there's a need for some kind of what I call metaphysical revisionism. That seems to be the order of the day. And well, there are various, when we ask what is metaphysical revisionism in this sense, there are various options on the table. Usually in philosophy, maybe not just in philosophy, the thought is the orthodoxy is always imagined as either physicalism or materialism on the one hand and dualism on the other. So if you're not materialist, well, you got to be a dualist. Well, but no, that's not the only options by any stretch of the imagination. And there are various options. We may mention some of the major ones. Panpsychism, which gains more traction nowadays. Idealism in various sort of ways, subjective, objective, various options here. Neutral monism, double aspect theory, even various unorthodox forms of physicalism, which go beyond structure more explicitly, or some kind of proto-phenomenalism, and so on and so forth. There's a whole forest there. And of course, there's a group. What?
1 minute, if you could wrap up.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up. But it can't be business as usual, right? that's my message here. Now, I think interactivism is radical enough in its adoption of a thoroughgoing process metaphysics, and this is laudable. But it is a different kind of radicalism that is called for here in this case. Yeah, now I mean, I suppose I could stop here. There's another one slide, but this just talk about can interactivism embrace the notion that consciousness may be fundamental? You know, this would require breaking away. I think maybe it's worth making this point because it relates to my question to Richard before. I think it would require one of the things, breaking away more decisively from the specter of materialism, because to my understanding, it's not enough, although it's all in the right direction, but to insist on something that is a framework that is more organicist rather than mechanistic, more process and oriented and dynamic rather than static and whatever substance. But there has to be, all of this can still be accommodated within some kind of materialism, or at least, you know, what is the alternative framework that is on offer here? There are other questions which have to do, I'll skip that, but it also raises questions about emergence more generally. Of course, this is one of the very central issue in interactivism, so it's also very sensitive, and I don't have time to speak of it, so I won't. I'll just say that it's not only with respect to consciousness per se, but once we think of consciousness as more fundamental, perhaps other questions such as its role in normativity and so on become again more relevant and intriguing. But I think that much that is of great value can be retained in any case, you know, the process metaphysics, the wonderful account of representation, language, and so on. And even those aspects that seems to be more problematic could be readjusted or re-envisioned in a way that perhaps, you know, this kind of modification is not just necessarily trouble, it could also be opportunity for some fine things. So I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Let's give a round of applause to Itay. So Itay, thank you very much. I guess you've revealed yourself as a Sith Lord. The talk was lovely though, and we'll go ahead with our usual format in terms of people raising their hand electronically. Of course, we'll squeeze Mark in there, I think at some point for sure. Okay, yes, his hand up, great. So let's start with Ken.
You're muted, Ken.
Yes, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I had thought I'd seen other hands up ahead of mine, but anyway, I'll be very brief. One is, I'm sorry, Kant does not have Hume's view of causation. Kant expressly analyzes and justifies a transient account of causality. Contra Hume, please scrub the bad empiricist history of philosophy out of your consciousness, please. As for the hard problem of matter, as soon as it's formulated in the way that Galen Strawson likes, matter behind the mathematical structure described by physics, as soon as you put in behind, you've turned it into an unanswerable metaphysical problem, which is what he wants. Forget it. It's a bad model of physics to say it's nothing but mathematics. As for the issues about consciousness, the hard problem is getting philosophers and some others used to the simple phrase, I don't know, right? Given our current state of science and neuroscience, there is no reason to expect us to have enough information on neuronal processing to have a clue about how it generates even our experience of motor control, which is where you started, Itay. You know, I think that you've got to keep this issue about control and monitoring in central view. It's quite a lot that we can pay attention to our environs and we can pay attention to one another. And on occasion, we can pay attention to some of our own thoughts. But why we should expect those skills and capacities to suffice to explain how we can be aware of some of our own thoughts and some of our own experiences and some of our own feelings, I don't know. And I stop there. Thank you.
All right, Itay. So there was a handful there, of course, picking.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the scholarly claim about Hume. Well, thanks for that. It's just that not much depends on that other than, a good example lost. But the point was general, right? The point was general. And I was thinking that you may have some reservation about even using the term transcendental, for which I prepared an answer, namely that the notion of transcendental didn't start with Kant. He also stole that term from the medievals who use it in a different sense, but you spared me that criticism, so thank you.
The one footnote about that is when Kant uses it, it concerns issues of accuracy and validity, not explanation.
Right, but I think it can be creatively modified to different contexts. Just Kant himself modified the notion of the transcendental from the original medieval use, which spoke about communissima and not about synthetic a priori or anything of that sort. As for the claim about structuralism, well, that's an issue here that need to be looked into. But all I can say, it's definitely not just Gale and Strawson. It's a claim that been made already by Russell and already by eminent scientists such as Eddington, and till today.
Ken, maybe, guys, just one second. We're going to stick to our format. Go ahead with your response, and because we don't want Mark not to have a chance as well.
Right. So I'd be cautious of giving up on that claim, at least on based of what I heard so far. But I'll thank you for raising it, and I'll bear it in mind with an open mind. About the question that we don't know, well, yeah, we don't know, but I think we do. I think the question is, what is it that we don't know? We don't know perhaps what are the limits, how far science can get us. But there are certain things that for which we can make an sort of like in principle argument, given what it seems that is described. If there is in principle lacuna, if there is a lacuna for which there's good ground to think that it is in principle, then the attitude of putting our faith that the science of the future will perform a magic trick, which is, by the way, what we've been waiting for decades, notice, doesn't seem to me to be any, rational approach in that problem.
Okay.
But thank you for all your points. Yeah.
So why don't we go to Mark, who had his hand up next?
Okay, I've got a whole page of notes here. The basic outline that Itay gave, I think, is mostly accurate, but with some critical omissions and I think a few commissions that I would have problems with. First of all, the method of disentanglement. I don't know if I've ever called it that, but maybe that works partly.
No, that's me. That's me. Just
yeah. But it misses an essential phase and slightly mischaracterizes, but I think importantly mischaracterizes a later phase. The first phase is diagnosis. You can't rid a realm of what I take to be these problems until you've diagnosed them, and they're not always evident. As a matter of fact, I think I've illustrated with a few stories that sometimes it's taken me years or months, literally years or months, to figure out that there were some presuppositions involved that I didn't agree with. And then the next phase is a constructive phase. So it's not just ridding. If you've got a tentative diagnosis, you have to figure out a model that supposedly or hopefully doesn't make the same mistakes. And that's a constructive process. And that's as much a science process as it is a philosophy process, which gets me into some of my other issues here. A few places you worded things that I would have trouble with. Whether they lead to later problems, I don't know. But like, you talk about knowledge of sensory motor contingency. Well, Noe talks about it that way. Reagan, maybe, maybe not, but I don't. It's not knowledge of sensory motor contingency that gives you an aspect of experience. It's the process of apperceptively anticipating the possibility of sensory motor contingent interactions. And so knowledge just doesn't capture that. When you were talking about me arguing against the gap and that this is not a unitary phenomena, and sort of what you were alluding to were things like the macroevolutionary model of knowing, learning, emotions, and consciousness, that's all true, but it overlooked the fact that there's also an aspectual issue here. It's not just that there's a hierarchy, there's different aspects of experience that we're trying to account for. And even in the lowest level experience, whatever that might be, there are going to be multiple aspects. And so what these models are trying to account for are those aspects. So I claim, for example, that the account I offer can account for a contentful flow, can account for situatedness, can account for having a point of view, can account for multiple aspects. Are those the only relevant aspects, or have I got some of them wrong? Well, that's always possible. I mean, certainly one consequence of this whole model is that almost everything is fallible, including these models and their submodels. But the test is not a test of non-experiential entails experiential, at least not as I'm approaching it. The test is one of, can you account for all of the aspects? Or is there some in principle reason why you cannot? And as Ken was pointing out, it doesn't do just to say there may be aspects that have not been accounted for. That's always true. That's necessarily true. I would give the example of life. Life can seem mysterious too, but progressively biochemistry and other sciences have accounted for more and more aspects of life. Have we accounted for every possible aspect of life? I don't know, but that's no longer a question because we've accounted for so many of them. It seems like, you know, you bring up one and somebody will do some research on it, and in 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades, somebody will figure out an account of that aspect of life. A more formal example would be Turing's explication of effective procedure. You can't prove that Turing successfully accounted for every aspect of the notion of effective procedure, because effective procedure is not a formal notion. So you just don't get the formal relationship there. The same here. Another point where I think you were missing something, you were talking about postulating internal relations. My claim is that I've modeled internal relations. I haven't just postulated them. And the model might be wrong, or my argument for the model might be wrong, but is not just a postulation. If correct, it's a metaphysical property that these things involve internal relations. That actually undercuts a whole lot of your argument, but not all of it, because the basic point is that there's a bunch of stuff I haven't accounted for, and I'm perfectly in agreement with that. Let's see. I guess one further little comment. In the early 70s, Meisner, Thorne, and Wheeler, in their book on gravity, commented that the current knowledge of the vacuum, as of the early 70s, was akin to the knowledge of a tabletop, as of a century or two or whatever previous to that, because we didn't know about van der Waals forces, we didn't really know about molecules and atoms, all this kind of stuff. We're still exploring. And these explorations have more and more and more turned on, throughout the history of science, turned on a movement to process and a movement to emergence. So, as I've said before, phlogiston doesn't exist, but fire is a process. Caloric doesn't exist, but heat is a process. Magnetic fluid doesn't exist, but magnetism is a property of a process. Vital fluid doesn't exist, but life seems to be a process, and all of these various emergent properties. I see myself as continuing that sort of exploration. Every one of them is fallible. It's still most intuitive with respect to life because it still has this air of mystery. And you can say something about, oh, well, you know, we don't fully understand life. Well, I don't claim that we do, but an argument that we cannot in principle understand life in some naturalistic sense. It just seems to me A, doesn't work, and B, has faded into history. My claim is that we are in a kind of a similar position with respect to experience and consciousness, that, yeah, possibly there are aspects to experience and consciousness that we'll never be able to account for naturalistically. And if we can't, then maybe some sort of panpsychism or something like that, although they've got very serious problems of their own. You know, maybe that would be an alternative. But it seems to me that it's not only worth pursuing these kinds of possibilities, however fallible they are, but it's also the best approach in the contemporary field. And you mentioned Galen Strawson, so I'll end with an anecdote about Galen Strawson. Galen Strawson and I gave talks in the same panel. This was a while ago. And, you know, he was giving his kinds of arguments about how naturalism isn't sufficient, et cetera. But I went up to him afterward and I asked him, and I've had some brief talks with him since then too. I asked him what he thought about the model that I proposed. And his response was, oh, I'd prefer to forget that, because he understood that it just undercut all of his arguments. So take that for what it's worth, which may not be much, but anyway, it's just kind of an interesting response that he had.
Okay, great. So we hit our hour, but we'll maybe push on a little more, and then we'll cut lunch a touch short and our break 5 minutes short. Itay, do you want to respond to Mark?
Yes, thank you. I guess at least the really interesting stuff here, it has to do with more general questions. I think part of what here creates some problem is that there's a certain, perhaps some kind of gestalt switch. There are those who tend to think about the problem, you know, as if take it as an axiom that, you know, this is like the final frontier of science. Science has to solve the problem of consciousness just as it is any other problem. And you use the sort of like how should we call it? Positive induction, right? Past success. So here we come. It may be hard, but we're going to solve it, and so on. On the other hand, I mean, if you look at the problem of consciousness and its history, it seems to be the kind of thing that really resists, and that sort of a happy induction seems to break down here. Now, again, I know, of course, you will say, well, it seems at other points that this was the situation in regard to life and so on. By the way, I don't think that the problem of life is solved, because I don't think that the problem of consciousness is solved. And I don't think you have life without consciousness, but never mind that, just me. You know, it's a question of how you see the world, of whether this kind of position, which in a way is some sort of scientism, right? It's this idea, and it actually came here in the conference, right? Philosophy of science is philosophy enough, and that sort of thing, which I think is a terrible mistake. It's kind of like, we have metaphysics. Metaphysics is.
Wait a minute, are you trying to attribute that position to me?
No, not to you. Not to you. I said it came out a few times, right? Just disclaim. What I'm saying is more general, that there seems to be this assumption, right, that because science is successful and powerful and so on, you know, that is just a matter of time and it will solve the problem of consciousness. I think there are serious arguments also for another position that we need to take seriously, which is that in this case it shows us some limits and opens up, you know, to what was always the case, that there is no science without metaphysics, that metaphysics is indispensable, that philosophy is never philosophy, philosophy of science is never philosophy enough. Yeah, and I think this is the watershed, which may create some problems of communication at this point.
Itay, are you fine if we move on to Adrian's question?
But yes. I mean, this was just the general point. I guess that's more or less what I wish to say on that.
I have a quick response to that.
Yes.
I would agree with everything you said there in that little bit. I would point out that I've argued in multiple places that the reason that experience, that mentality, and so on is the last one is because the other sorts of emergences that scientists have addressed have not involved normativity. And that imposes a special additional problem. So normativity, I argue, is the reason we are still struggling with mental stuff. And because we have to cross the Humean divide or Parmenidean divide or whoever you want to attribute it to. And I claim, of course, with fallibilism, et cetera, to be able to do that. But anyway, I would agree with you that it's not just a positive induction, although the positive induction, I think, gives some support here.
All right, Adrian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I want to follow up on what they were just talking about. I think that by allowing ourselves to have what I call a two-pile theory of nature, where you have a pile of stuff that can be known and a pile of stuff that can't be known. And even if you don't know what goes in which pile yet, by admitting that there can be two piles, you're stuck with the same situation as you are with the elemental theory, or a similar situation anyway. So with the elemental theory, you have the problem of why only 5 or 6 elements and not, say, 100 elements, right? Or any other foundational thing like that. I think you have a very similar problem when you allow yourself to have multiple metaphysical realms, right? So why only 2 and not 3? Well, in the case of knowable and unknowable, I think those are probably the only 2 categories. However, if you admit one problem that is very difficult right now to be, if you put that in the unknowables pile, and then later it turns out to be knowable, well, you've made a mistake. But so what? The problem is every time you have a new hard problem, you now have to make a decision. Does it go in the unknowable pile or does it stay in the knowable pile? And from a Bickard naturalism perspective, all we can do is assume that there is no unknowable pile and keep going as if there isn't. And perhaps the project of naturalism will ultimately fail, but it'll fail as a consequence of our positive actions, not of our just deciding we're going to give up on something.
So Itay, do you want to give a response to that?
Yeah. Very quickly. I mean, I want to focus on the first point you raised. Well, the second one, to me, it failed from the start. In retrospect, that's not what I believed for years. But I think the notion of the characterization of the physical world is rife with abstractions, as White had pointed out long ago. And it's given that you abstract away, you thereby prevent the ability to account for reality as a whole. And then lo and behold, it turns out that you cannot. But anyways, that's not the point. I mean, this issue is obviously has to be, articulated sometimes somewhere else. I wanted to focus more on your first point briefly. When you speak about the known and the unknown and two piles, or you describe this as if it's a commitment to some kind of a de facto dualism, right? Now that's something that I don't understand, and I guess I would beg to differ. I don't think that follows. You see, first of all, I would deny that its consciousness is unknown. To say that it cannot be known in all of its respect purely by science, it's not to say that it cannot be known. Science can tell us a whole lot about consciousness, make no mistake, right? I'm not arguing against that, first of all. Second, those aspects which cannot be learned through science have been experienced for millennia by people who practitioned consciousness very seriously with other methods, right? So the claim that it's unknown, I deny. Although I have no problem with the fact that the world, certain aspects, the deepest aspects of the world, were probably bound to remain a mystery forever. But I want to say something about the dualism. That doesn't necessarily follow either, right? I mean, definitely not in what I try to do, which is, it will take in a direction that maybe many of you wouldn't like, because it's more in a more idealist direction, but it's a kind of way where you start with consciousness, let's say, if you cannot explain the phenomenal in terms of the physical, perhaps you can explain the physical as an appearance of what is more fundamentally experienced. And you may not like it, or you may think, there's all sorts of problems with that. But one thing which cannot be charged here is that it's necessarily assuming some kind of dualism. If there is a dualism on that view, it's more an epistemic dualism of what is external, what is considered an external object because it's an appearance to another center of consciousness, and what is in itself an experiential reality. It's not an ontological dualism in any obvious sense.
I wasn't suggesting it was ontological. I was suggesting it was epistemological. The problem doesn't go away.
So guys, we're really gonna start having problems. So I'm gonna actually end it here for the official thing. If you want to continue at the break, no problem. So maybe we're gonna everybody come back at 33 after, so a 10-minute break, and we'll start our next talk at 33 after.
Okay.
Hey, Jed, yeah, is Robert here? I